The first sound is never the blast of orbital fire. It is silence, an unnatural stillness that spreads across a planet like a sickness, heavy as if the very air knows what is coming. The people sense it in their bones before the first warning. Klaxons scream. Vox traffic falls quiet. The skies, once filled with trade haulers and patrol craft, empty as if abandoned by the stars themselves. And somewhere in the void above, unseen and patient, a verdict has already been written in fire. To be marked for Exterminatus is to be erased not by chance nor war but by judgment, the cold and absolute hand of the Imperium descending without mercy. It is not death alone but obliteration, the kind that leaves no song, no relic, no whisper in the dust. It is the kind of ending that strips even memory from stone. Before we descend into this story, if the dark weight of the Imperium and the silence of doomed worlds grips you as much. The air of the hive was different that morning, not thinner, not fouler. It had always been a haze of promethium fumes and recirculated staleness, but heavier, as if the city itself exhaled and forgot to breathe again. Workers noticed it first, though none spoke aloud. They trudged toward the manufactorums with eyes downcast, hands already raw with yesterday's labor, yet even the clank of boots on metal gantries seemed muted. A hush clung to every surface, like dust settling after a collapse no one had seen. An old Vox set rattled in a hab-block corner, its signal sputtering between fragments of half-heard transmissions. For weeks the Vox had been crowded with reports, pirate raids on the far outskirts, rumors of Xeno sightings in the abandoned mine belts, conflicting orders from the governor's palace. But today the static itself seemed reluctant to break. Where chatter once squawked endlessly, there came only the long hiss of silence. A mother smacked the side of the machine to rouse it, muttering at the waste of credits she'd poured into its upkeep. Yet she did not notice her child watching the ceiling, frowning, as though he heard something vast shifting far above the clouds. The shrines were crowded before dawn. It was not a festival day, nor had the ecclesiarchy declared a holy fast. Still, the faithful pressed shoulder to shoulder, clutching worn aquilus and prayer scrolls, whispering litanies to ward away things unnamed. Candles guttered in the recycled air, wax dripping onto cracked tiles blackened by centuries of smoke. A confessor raised his voice to thunder about vigilance, his words echoing in the nave. The eyes of the master of mankind fall always upon us. Let no heresy be found in our hearts, lest his gaze turn to judgment. The crowd murmured assent, but in the silence that followed, unease returned. They prayed not for forgiveness, but for reprieve. Across the agri-zones, farmers halted their work to squint at the skies. The clouds had thinned strangely, as though light from distant stars tried to pierce them, faint and cold. One man swore he saw streaks of metal gleam far above, vanishing before he could call another to look. Livestock grew restless, groks lowing and straining against their pens, nostrils flaring at scents no human nose could place. And in the governor's palace, behind armored walls and the guarded gates of the planetary defense force, arguments had already broken into shouts. The astropaths had gone silent. For days they had complained of screams in the warp, of visions that clawed their eyes from within. Now they sat like wax figures in their sanctums, mouths open, eyes glazed, no sound passing their lips. The governor's advisors pressed him with reports, Vox silence from the orbital docks, scattered disappearances in the lower hive, panic buying in the markets. Still he clutched the armrest of his throne, sweating beneath the golden sash of office, whispering that the fleet would answer. The fleet must answer. Yet above the world there was no movement. The void was vast and silent, yet not empty. Something lingered there, massive and still, as though a judge waited with pen already poised. The planet spun beneath its own death sentence, ignorant no longer, but unable to speak its fear aloud. On the hive's outer levels, children played near the ventilation shafts, chasing echoes with sticks and stones. One froze mid-step, head cocked, listening to vibrations that no one else heard. The sky's humming, he whispered. His friends laughed and returned to their games, but he lingered, pressing his ear to the warm metal. Somewhere in the great cathedral of stars, something vast was humming indeed. Not the sound of ships arriving, nor thunder from storms, a vibration deeper than metal, older than the world itself. Night came with no relief. The void above glowed faintly with auroras of green and violet light, colors never before seen across the skies of this world. Miners paused their shifts to gape, faces lit with awe and dread. Scholars whispered of warp storms, of broken navigation beacons, of omens unfit to name. In the hab blocks, the auroras painted ceilings and walls with ghostly hues, and children cried in their sleep, their dreams filled with burning oceans and endless ash. The silence did not relent. The air itself seemed to be listening. The morning after the auroras, the hive woke uneasy. Vendors set out their carts along the transport spines, but few customers came. The smell of fried grox fat and stimroot tea carried through the corridors as always. But instead of the usual bargaining shouts, there was only the scrape of shutters closing too early. Fear had a taste, stale, metallic, like blood lingering on the tongue. Even those who could not name it knew it was there. A group of hab workers gathered near a broken lumen post, whispering like conspirators. One swore he had seen black-armored figures moving through the underhive, helmets sealed, weapons slung across their shoulders. Another claimed the Inquisition had already set foot on the planet, investigating heresy too deep to be cleansed by words. No one dared to laugh. Rumors of the Inquisition were not rumors one dismissed. They were seeds of terror planted in the dark, each sprouting into dread of what might follow. In the spires above, where the wealth of the planet lived in steel towers veined with gold, the same unease spread in quieter tones. Noble houses delayed their feasts, their balconies drawn tight against the sky. Envoys whispered behind marble doors that the tithe ships had not departed, that docking clamps still bound them to silent stations above. Some suggested rebellion in hushed tones, a refusal to send their grain and minerals until the Imperium explained itself. Others silenced them with a glance, for such talk could be more dangerous than any Xenos raiding party. Meanwhile, the shrines had grown crowded beyond reason. Priests preached through the day and into the night, their voices ragged from endless prayers. A new chant began to rise among the faithful, not from the lips of the ecclesiarchy but from the desperation of the masses. Deliver us, Emperor of Terror. Shield us, Master of mankind. Turn not thy gaze away. The words echoed like a drumbeat in the hive, carried by mouths too afraid to stop. The governor convened his council once more. The hall was heavy with incense meant to mask the sweat of fear, yet nothing could hide the tremor in his hands. Reports piled before him, communications from the orbital platforms severed, trade routes collapsing, planetary defense forces encountering nothing. No raiders, no Xenos armies, no chaos warbands at their gates. Only silence. A silence so deliberate it felt sculpted, as if a knife had cut their world away from the galaxy. One of his generals, a broad man with scars across his cheek, slammed a fist against the table. We must prepare for siege. Something is coming, something vast. I can feel it. His words carried the weight of iron, yet none argued, for in their hearts they knew he spoke truth. The governor only stared at the ceiling, muttering prayers under his breath. In the hive's deepest levels, where light never touched, and pipes wept with condensation, gangs whispered of the end times. They scrawled crude signs of the Aquila on rusted bulkheads, mixing oil with blood, begging for mercy in symbols more desperate than devout. Some vanished into the dark, claiming they would escape the Emperor's gaze by hiding where even his light could not find them. Their bodies were found days later, torn apart by things that had nothing to do with the Imperium, yet not all bowed their heads. There were those who smiled at the silence, who felt the weight of impending doom and welcomed it. In forgotten chapels, candles burned black, and voices rose in praise not of terror, but of darker gods. For some, fear became fuel for heresy. The silence of the Imperium was read not as warning, but as abandonment, and abandonment left space for whispers from the warp. Still, for the majority, life persisted in strange parody. Workers dragged themselves to the manufactorums, though machines often fell idle. Children attended their scholar lessons, though instructors glanced nervously at the Vox every few moments. Guards patrolled empty streets, lasguns slung across weary shoulders, waiting for an enemy that did not come. And all the while, the sky remained unchanged, streaked with unnatural auroras, trembling faintly with vibrations too deep to measure. The riots did not last. They burned bright and sudden, a spark of defiance in the choking dark, but the planetary defense force moved swiftly. The clatter of boots echoed through the trade districts. Las rifles raised, orders barked with voices that shook more from fear than authority. Barricades of overturned carts and shattered crates collapsed under disciplined volleys. By nightfall, the market floors were slick with blood and oil, bodies dragged aside into alleys where no one dared to look too long. Yet even as silence returned, it was not the silence of peace, but of terror deepened. Far above, the astropaths had already gone beyond fear. Within their sanctum, doors locked and guarded by solemn clerks, their minds had unraveled in unison. The walls stank of incense burned to choking strength, but the smoke could not mask the copper tang of blood. Dozens of the Emperor's chosen lay on the floor, their eyes wide and milky, their tongues muttering fragments of broken speech. One clawed at his own flesh, scribbling visions across the stone with trembling fingers. "The sky is iron. The sky is iron," he repeated until his throat tore raw. Another sat in perfect stillness, whispering a single phrase over and over, "Ash to the roots, ash to the roots." The corpsmaster, a woman whose sightless sockets once burned with sanctioned flame, had collapsed upon the dais. Before death stilled her, she screamed so loudly the guards outside swore they felt the sound in their teeth. "He has turned his face," she cried, "and the stars will burn for it." Those words spread like wildfire through the palace halls, slipping past locked doors and hushed tongues. Servants whispered them to soldiers, soldiers to their families, families to the streets. By the time dusk fell, the whole hive seemed to murmur the same dreadful prophecy. The Emperor had turned away. In the manufactorum stacks, machines halted altogether. No one could keep them running. Power grids flickered without warning, lifts jammed between levels, conveyors froze mid-motion with sparks dancing from their belts. Tech priests strode among the broken works, their mechadendrites writhing, their vox grills hissing distorted canticles to the Omnissiah. But even their binharic prayers lacked conviction. Some claimed the machine spirit itself recoiled, aware of doom descending, unwilling to waste labor on the condemned. The governor summoned his advisors again, but fewer came. Several had vanished without a trace, their quarters empty, their names struck from rolls as if they had never existed. Those who remained avoided each other's eyes. One brought a report of ships seen high above the stratosphere, vast silhouettes too immense to be trading vessels, too still to be patrols. The governor clutched the parchment with trembling hands, reading the words again and again until the letters blurred. Then, without speaking, he cast it into the brazier at his side and demanded no one else repeat it aloud. Among the common folk, stories multiplied. Some swore they had heard hymns in the night sky, voices like choirs drawn out across the void, too vast to belong to any mortal throat. Others said the Emperor himself was coming, not in glory but in judgment, that his silence was his verdict, and his hand would soon strike. Mothers hushed their children with promises that faith would protect them, fathers clutched weapons that would never matter. And still above them all, the auroras burned, brighter with each passing night, green fire clawing across the heavens. Then came the sound, not loud, not piercing, but low, a vibration so deep it seemed to rise from the marrow itself. Entire districts woke in unison, startled not by any siren, but by the hum of something vast pressing against their bones. Windows rattled though no wind stirred, pipes trembled in their housings, and the air shivered as though it carried weight beyond measure. Some fell to their knees, crying out in prayer. Others clamped their hands over their ears, though the sound was not in their ears at all. It was inside them, patient and immovable, like the judgment of stone. The dawn rose pale, its light washed thin by the lingering auroras, and for a brief moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. Workers did not gather for the day's shifts, markets remained shuttered, even the shrines fell strangely empty, their doors closed as if faith itself had grown tired of echoing unanswered prayers. The entire hive felt like a coffin sealed too early, with the living trapped inside. Then the first signs appeared in the skies. Not fire, not yet, but streaks of metal descending and vanishing back into the void, like claws scraping against the planet's firmament. Some swore they were only meteorites. Others recognized them for what they were: orbital shells testing atmosphere, data capture devices that did not belong to any merchant fleet. The watchers on the spires whispered one word with cracked voices: fleet. A fleet had come, not to trade, not to protect, but to pass judgment. Panic bloomed faster than any order could contain it. Vox lines crackled with desperate questions, but none carried answers. The administratum clerks refused to leave their chambers, sealing doors with sigils of warding and tearing out the Vox wires as though silence might grant them mercy. The governor, sleepless and hollow-eyed, gave no new orders. He sat alone in his audience hall, staring at the great mural of the emperor on the far wall. His lips moved in constant frantic prayer, but not once did he look at the men who came to demand action. It was as if the planet no longer had a ruler, only a man waiting to die. Out in the lower hive, people ran through the corridors with whatever they could carry: family shrines clutched under arms, scraps of food stuffed into sacks, crude weapons gripped in trembling hands. Some rushed upward, desperate to reach the surface as if they could flee to the stars. Others burrowed deeper, into maintenance tunnels and forgotten mines, believing the rock itself might shield them. No one spoke of survival in years, only in days, only in hours. And yet amid the fear, there were moments of clarity. A scribe in a forgotten archive copied sacred texts by candlelight, knowing his work would never be read. A child in the underhive painted the imperial aquila across a rusted bulkhead, its lines jagged but proud, as though faith itself could etch defiance into steel. A soldier cleaned his lasgun with careful hands, whispering apologies to the weapon as if it were a comrade he would soon abandon. These were not acts of hope, they were rituals of farewell. As the final night of the chapter fell, the hum returned, louder, closer, carrying with it the certainty of something vast positioning itself in orbit. The auroras flared crimson, drowning the stars. Families huddled together in silence. Priests screamed themselves hoarse in the shrines. The governor wept in his throne room, and above them, unseen but undeniable, the judgment of the Imperium hung waiting, patient as a blade poised above the neck. The world was no longer uncertain, it was marked. The first days after certainty were not filled with fire but with collapse. To know one's world has been marked is to walk in a half-light where every hour is both gift and curse. Panic hardened into frenzy. The hive, already choking on silence, now tore itself apart in noise. Markets that once served millions became battlegrounds. Grain sacks were ripped open by desperate hands, their contents scattered across steel floors and trampled into useless dust. Families clawed at each other for ration tokens, teeth bared, eyes wild. What little food remained was hoarded in fortified rooms by gangs who had risen overnight from the wreckage of order. Even the PDF patrols found themselves begging for bread from the very people they were meant to command. The shrines, once sanctuaries of murmured prayers, now shook with the wailing of the desperate. Priests tried to steady the faithful with chants of salvation, promising that the emperor's judgment was not abandonment but purification. Yet their words faltered against the raw screams of the crowd. Women pressed infants toward the altars, begging for blessings strong enough to shield flesh from fire. Men scrawled entire litanies across their own skin in blood and ink, believing divine words carved into their flesh might render them immune to orbital bombardment. When the priests themselves began to falter, eyes wide, voices trembling, the crowds grew violent. Altars cracked under fists, relics were stolen, and the sacred halls of the emperor filled not with hymns but with shrieks. In the palace spires, nobles fared little better. Some demanded evacuation ships, screaming at servants and guards alike to open the locked docking bays. Others sought alliances, trading jewels and titles for a place in an imaginary escape that never came. A handful fell to ritual poison, preferring a death of their own choosing to the slow unraveling below. By the third day the once proud halls of nobility were as empty and echoing as the manufactorums, filled only with dust and broken glass. The governor, broken by silence, spoke no more to his council. His face, once painted with powder and gilded with medals, had grown ashen. He sat alone at his throne, eyes fixed on the mural of the emperor, lips whispering without sound. When his generals demanded orders, he raised a trembling hand for silence and nothing more. By then many had ceased reporting to him at all, commanding their own men as they saw fit, though none of it mattered. For how could walls or rifles defy a sentence passed from orbit? And so chaos deepened. Power grids failed district by district, plunging entire sections into darkness. In those blackened corridors, gangs ruled, dragging the weak into service or slaughter. The underhive roared with fire, smoke pouring upward in pillars that stained even the highest towers. Entire families vanished into the sewers, believing the rock would cradle them when the sky finally burned. Others fled into the wastelands beyond the hive walls, their silhouettes lost among poisoned dunes. Few returned. Those who did spoke of skies haunted by strange lights and the sensation of being watched by something immeasurable, as though the stars themselves had eyes. The astropaths, what remained of them, offered no guidance. Most lay comatose, bodies wasting away under the constant chanting of attendants. A handful still whispered, but their words were poisoned fragments, carrying no hope, only dread. The emperor walks away, one rasped voice scraping like iron on stone. He walks away and nothing follows but fire. Guards begged for silence, but the words had already taken root in the minds of all who heard them. Everywhere order fractured, but amid the screams there was still the faint rhythm of ritual. Soldiers polished their lasguns by candlelight, marching patrols through empty streets as though discipline itself might outlive annihilation. Mothers braided their daughters' hair by flickering lumen globes, telling them bedtime stories of saints who had faced worse fates and still sung hymns until the end. Even in the darkest days, ritual clung stubbornly to life, not to preserve hope, but to preserve identity, to die as Imperials, not animals. And always above them, unseen but constant, the weight of the fleet pressed down like a lid upon a coffin. Ships the size of continents hung silent in orbit, their weapons still cold, yet their presence alone was enough to hollow the planet of faith. The people no longer asked if judgment was coming, they asked only when. The riot spread like infection. What began in the market soon bled into every level of the hive. Entire transit spines clogged with barricades of scrap metal and overturned haulers. Smoke from burning hab blocks choked the air until even those high in the spires could smell the reek of plastic and flesh. Sirens wailed without order, sometimes blaring for hours, sometimes dying mid-note as power grids collapsed. Voxcasters shrieked contradictory commands: return to work, stay in your homes, report to the shrines, report to the barracks. The confusion only fed the chaos. The Astra Militarum regiments stationed on the planet fared no better. Discipline cracked beneath the weight of dread. Soldiers obeyed orders by day, but at night many slipped away to find their families. Barracks were left half empty, patrols staggered by desertion. Those who remained loyal fought not against Xenos or heretics, but against their own neighbors. Firing lines cut through crowds of civilians, lasgun beams searing the air, bodies falling in tangled heaps. The crack of shots echoed across corridors where children once played, and yet the soldiers' eyes betrayed them. They knew these were not enemies but kin. Each trigger pulled was a confession. Their world was already lost. In one district, a lieutenant named Karos held his men in rigid formation as the mob surged. He barked orders, voice raw, but his soldiers faltered when they recognized faces among the crowd. Mothers, brothers, even sons. When the first volley was ordered, a corporal refused, dropping his weapon. Within moments half the squad had joined him. Karos raised his pistol to execute them for treason, but his voice broke before the shot left the barrel. The mob surged forward, and the regiment dissolved in an instant. Such scenes repeated across the hive until the Astra Militarum were no longer a shield of the Emperor, but fragments scattered across a city tearing itself apart. The underhive became a kingdom of shadows. Gangs grew fat on stolen ration crates. their symbols daubed in blood across bulkheads. They preached survival, not faith, ruling with iron pipes and scavenged las pistols. Some declared themselves saviors, offering protection in exchange for obedience. Others embraced blasphemy openly, daubing symbols of the ruinous powers across their skin and swearing that the silence above proved the emperor's death. In the suffocating dark of the tunnels, those whispers spread quickly. The line between survival and heresy thinned until no one could tell them apart. Above, the nobility grew desperate. Their pleas for evacuation reached shrill pitches, echoing through empty docking bays that remained sealed by Mechanicus locks. No vessel departed, no vessel arrived. Their wealth became meaningless, their banners nothing but rags fluttering in stale air. Some nobles turned their own guards into raiding parties, descending the spires to seize what food and fuel they could from the common levels. Others barricaded themselves within their palaces, waiting for salvation that would never come. By the end of the week, most towers stood silent, their high windows shattered by fire from below. The shrines, though broken, continued to draw the faithful. The priests preached with hollow eyes, urging calm, urging faith, urging penitence. But desperation twisted worship into frenzy. Pilgrims carved sacred verses into the walls with knives, their hands bleeding as they worked. Men and women flung themselves upon the altars in fits of possession, screaming for the emperor to notice them. When relics failed to answer, some tore them apart, burning bones and icons alike in pyres that filled the sanctums with choking smoke. The shrines no longer smelled of incense, but of ash, and all the while, the fleet above remained silent. Not a single weapon discharged, not a single broadcast reached the surface. It was as though the planet had been forgotten, yet the weight of that forgetfulness was more terrible than fire. For fire would at least bring an end. Silence stretched each day into a wound that refused to close. Hunger arrived faster than anyone expected. The hive had always lived on the edge of scarcity, its people dependent on the endless rhythm of shipments and tithe quotas. But with the docks sealed and the administratum clerks vanished into silence, the cycle broke. Grain silos emptied within days. Water reserves were rationed to drops. The taste of recycled air grew metallic, foul with the stench of thousands packed too closely together, sweating, starving, praying. Starvation stripped away the last illusions of order. Families abandoned their homes, searching for food like scavenging beasts. Corpses appeared in the gutters, some shot for scraps, others gnawed upon when hunger drove the living past shame. Whispers of cannibalism moved through the hive like disease. Children disappeared into alleys and never returned. Every shadow held a predator. The governor's guard tried to stem the collapse, but with every passing hour they found themselves fighting ghosts. For each riot they crushed, another flared 3 corridors away. For each gang they executed, 2 more rose in their place. Discipline crumbled as quickly as the walls they defended. Soldiers shared stolen rations with their families, hiding food beneath armor plates, abandoning patrols to drag siblings and parents into what shelter they could find. It was in this void of control that the Mechanicus moved. Skitarii patrols began to appear in the streets, silent and deliberate, their red optics burning through the gloom. They were not there to restore order, nor to protect the starving. They marched with precision, guarding manufacturum stacks and power relays, securing data looms and sealed archives. To the desperate they offered no words, only the blank stare of chrome visors and the hum of augmented limbs. When mobs approached, Skitarii did not fire warning shots. They fired to kill. The machine god demanded order, and order was carved in blood. Tech priests broadcast Binharic canticles through vox grills mounted on towers, their voices warped by static and distortion. They spoke of maintenance cycles and purity of data, but the people heard only sermons without mercy. Some began to worship them, mistaking the cold efficiency of the Mechanicus for divine authority. Others hated them, hurling stones and curses at their patrols until Lasfire silenced them forever. Still, the manufacturums churned, even as the city collapsed. Great machines roared in the depths, fed by Skitarii guard producing shells plating promethium by the ton. The work did not stop, for it was not meant for the people. It was meant for the fleet above, for the Imperium itself, as though the planet's last labor was to forge its own funeral pyre. Workers dragged from the streets were chained to assembly lines, their hollow faces lit by the sparks of machines they no longer understood. The people saw this and knew the Imperium did not intend to save them. It intended to use them until the last breath, then wipe the slate clean, and in that knowledge, despair hardened into rage. Bands of deserters and civilians stormed manufactorum gates, hurling Molotov fire and makeshift explosives at steel doors that would never yield. Their screams filled the night, cries not of rebellion but of vengeance, as if their voices could rise high enough to pierce orbit and demand the Emperor answer. The Skitarii answered instead. Their rifles cut the mobs apart in lines of crimson light, bodies collapsing where they stood. The smell of burnt flesh mingled with machine oil, and the manufactorums roared on, indifferent. Above, the auroras blazed brighter. Green and crimson rivers of light spread across the heavens, warping the stars into shapes no scholar dared to name. Some claimed they saw eyes staring back, vast and endless, watching the planet writhe. Others whispered that the silence was mercy, that there comes a moment when despair ceases to be a feeling and becomes a condition of existence. The hive reached that moment. No longer did the people scream as loudly when the Skitarii opened fire. No longer did they curse the governor when ration lines collapsed. They simply endured, faces carved into masks of resignation, eyes emptied of hope. Hunger had stripped away rebellion, leaving only a gray inertia. Some chose their own ends. Families gathered in silent circles, drinking the last of their water laced with poisons scavenged from chem waste bins. Lovers climbed to the spires and hurled themselves into the void, preferring the fall to the slow gnaw of starvation. Others fled downward into the blackened depths of the underhive, where shadows swallowed them and whispers claimed they were devoured by things better left unnamed. The upper towers became mausoleums of silence, while the lower reaches became pits of howling madness. In the manufactorums the chains rattled on. Workers collapsed at their stations, hands blistered and bleeding, their bodies dragged aside by servitors and replaced with fresh captives. The machines never slowed. Smoke choked the sky until the auroras above gleamed through the haze like wounds torn in the firmament. Those who still believed muttered litanies to the Emperor begging for salvation. But more and more prayers twisted into accusations. Why had he abandoned them? Why had the throne condemned them to this slow extermination? Rumors spread like sickness. Some whispered that the Astra Militarum had already descended, hidden in the underhive, slaughtering in silence to thin the population. Others swore that the Emperor himself had turned his gaze away, deeming the planet unworthy. A few claimed the auroras were not the light of the warp at all, but the reflection of the fleet preparing fire from the heavens. Each rumor contradicted the next, yet all carried the same weight. The end was certain. The governor's palace still burned with light, though fewer dared approach its walls. His voice echoed through voxcasters less often, brittle and broken, as though even his spirit had withered beneath the burden of command. What remained of his guard had sealed the inner gates, their silhouettes visible against the glow of the great hall where once banquets had been held. The people no longer believed his promises, but they still stared at the palace as though it might yield a miracle. It never did. In the streets the silence became heavier than the gunfire had ever been. Whole hab blocks stood empty, their windows dark, their inhabitants vanished without word or trace. The wind moved through hollow chambers, carrying the scent of rot and ash. Children played with bones as if they were toys, too young to understand that their games were rehearsals for graves. The hive itself seemed to breathe slower, as though the city were dying in unison with its people, and through it all, the auroras pulsed brighter, painting the ruins in crimson and emerald. They looked less like lights now, and more like veins of some vast sickly heartbeat. The upper levels of the hive had burned themselves hollow, but the underhive still beckoned like a wound festering beneath scarred flesh. It had always been a place of shadows, where the forgotten and unwanted were cast, a labyrinth of rusted pipes, derelict tunnels and endless descent. Yet now, as the world starved above, the underhive became both refuge and tomb. Those who still clung to life fled downward, driven by desperation more than choice. The first steps into the depths felt like abandoning the last remnants of the Emperor's light. The air grew heavier, dense with chemical tang and the stench of refuse. Darkness pressed in, broken only by the flicker of chem lamps scavenged from the ruins. Walls sweated with condensation that tasted of rust, and every footfall echoed as if something vast listened from just beyond the curve of the next corridor. Down there, silence was more dangerous than noise. Silence meant watching eyes. Silence meant predators waiting for the weak. Those who had long called the underhive home watched the newcomers with contempt. They were thin and hollow-eyed, but not yet broken, not yet accustomed to the economy of shadows. The gangs that ruled the tunnels knew this. They bled the refugees dry, demanding scraps of food, clothing, even flesh in exchange for passage deeper. Knives did the talking, and lasfire ended conversations when tribute failed. Entire families disappeared at the whim of underhive lords, their screams swallowed by the labyrinth and forgotten by morning. Yet the underhive was not merely a den of men, it was alive in its own way, a decaying machine breathing in rhythm with its dying world. Great ventilation ducts pulsed like lungs, exhaling blasts of toxic heat. Pits glowed with runoff from reactors above, their surfaces bubbling like cauldrons of molten glass. Rats the size of hounds prowled the refuse heaps, their eyes glinting in the dark like embers. Mutants slithered in the half-light, bodies warped by centuries of radiation and chem exposure, their limbs grown twisted and wrong. Some were mindless, hungry beasts. Others still remembered what it was to be human, and hated those who reminded them of what they had lost. The descent carried whispers of worse, rumors of sealed chambers where lights had never shone, where mechanical groans echoed from walls that pulsed like muscle. Some spoke of cannibal tribes who had turned from the Emperor entirely, daubing their flesh in crude symbols of the warp, offering blood to voices only they could hear. Others whispered of deeper things, older than the hive, creatures unearthed when foundations were first laid. Things that had never left. For those who fled downward, choice ceased to matter. It was not about hope any longer, it was about hiding, about delaying the inevitable with one more day, one more breath. Mothers pressed rags against the mouths of crying infants, terrified the sound might draw attention from something in the dark. Men carried pipes or sharpened scrap metal, weapons more symbolic than effective, a thin barrier between their bodies and the predators that lurked in the depths. Above, the auroras still shone, faint and distant through cracks in the ceiling, reminding them that the sky itself burned. But below, the auroras twisted into strange reflections, shimmering in pools of chemical water, breaking into shapes that looked like faces. Some swore those faces mouthed words, promises or curses carried on the shimmer of light against poisoned water. The refugees learned not to stare. Staring too long meant madness. Madness meant death, and yet deeper they went, for there was nowhere else. The surface was already dead. The manufactorums had no mercy. The skies promised only fire, and so the people gave themselves to the underhive, and in doing so they gave themselves to the abyss. Violence was the law of the underhive, and now it was written not only in territory but in hunger. Gangs that once traded in narcotics and contraband turned their blades to food and flesh, extorting what little the refugees carried down from the surface. Bread crusts became currency, a flask of clean water worth more than gold. When no tribute could be found, the price was blood. Corpses lined the walkways, stripped of boots and clothing, left as warnings nailed to walls of rusted steel. The gangs were not merely criminals, they were kings of their domains, ruling stretches of tunnel like fiefdoms. Each bore its own markings, graffiti scrawled in glowing chems, symbols carved into steel bulkheads, banners of tattered cloth daubed with crude paints. To cross those boundaries without permission was to invite slaughter. Refugees who stumbled blind into rival turf rarely emerged with their bodies intact. Clashes erupted in sudden storms, knives flashing in the half-light, lasfire scorching the walls with seared black sigils. The air filled with the copper tang of blood and the hiss of cauterized wounds. Sometimes the fights were quick, a single volley scattering weaker gangs into the shadows. Sometimes they were drawn-out sieges, tunnels barricaded with scrap and bodies, the echoes of battle rolling down corridors like thunder. To the newcomers, it seemed madness, violence without reason, but to the Underhive lords it was order, a savage rhythm, a hierarchy etched into flesh and ash. Refugees had no choice but to pick sides. Some offered themselves to gangs as labor or cannon fodder, traded like livestock in exchange for scraps. Others tried to remain apart, huddling in abandoned habs or maintenance shafts, hoping invisibility could be mistaken for safety. But invisibility was a myth. In the Underhive everything was noticed, and everything was prey. Those who resisted learned swiftly the futility of defiance. A family that refused tribute was found dismembered, their remains hung from pipes, a silent warning glowing in the reflected light of chem flames. Children were dragged into gangs as errand runners, their small hands nimble enough to steal or stab where adults could not. The cycle fed itself, starvation drove them to crime, crime drew them into gangs, gangs demanded violence, and violence consumed them whole. Yet beneath the savagery lurked something stranger. Some gangs began to mark their kills with symbols not of paint or blood, but with carvings that spiraled unnaturally, as though drawn from memory not their own. Refugees whispered of figures in the dark, who whispered promises to the gang lords, voices that urged them to greater cruelty in exchange for power. No one admitted to seeing these figures clearly. No one wanted to. But the symbols spread, appearing on walls where no hand should have reached, daubed in colors no chem could produce. The auroras, faint through cracks above, seemed to pulse in answer. Their colors stained the shadows, green and red bleeding into the walls, into the eyes of those who stared too long. Violence grew wilder, no longer simply about territory, but about something deeper, some unseen hunger gnawing at the hive itself. Those who killed swore they felt stronger, that wounds healed faster, that their eyes could pierce the dark more clearly, and those who fell often did not stay long in silence. Their corpses were sometimes found days later, torn apart in ways no blade or claw could explain. The refugees clung together, praying harder than ever, clutching their scraps of parchment etched with the imperial aquila, whispering litanies through cracked lips. Yet even their prayers seemed thin in the tunnels, devoured by the void before the words could reach the throne. The silence after their voices died was worse than the screams of deeper still they went, past the turf wars and the rattling chains of gang dominion, into places even the Underhive lords feared to tread. The air thickened, fouled by centuries of unvented fumes, acrid with the stench of old industry. Walls dripped with moisture that was not quite water, slick with oils that clung to the skin like rot. Here the echoes stretched unnaturally far, footsteps bouncing back in distorted cadence, as though someone or something walked just behind. The gangs that pursued the refugees grew more hesitant in these depths. They shouted their war cries less, fired their weapons with caution, and glanced often over their shoulders. Even the most vicious predators seemed diminished here, their cruelty tempered by unease. For this was the realm of things older than their violence, creatures that had crawled into the forgotten corners of the hive when it was first raised and never left. The first signs were bones. Not the scattered remnants of gang violence, but ancient heaps piled high, gnawed clean and fused together with mineral accretions, as though centuries of death had been compressed into monuments of hunger. Then came the sounds, low chittering clicks, skittering across the walls and ceiling, punctuated by the scraping of claws on metal. Shapes flitted across the edge of vision too swift for the eye to hold. Some said they were vermin, rats grown monstrous in the dark. Others whispered of worse. When the attacks came, they were sudden and merciless. Shadows dropped from the ceilings, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, jaws opening far too wide for the size of the bodies that carried them. They were not human, nor entirely beast, their forms twisted by millennia of chem waste and radiation. Too many limbs, spines jagged with bone growth, teeth like shards of glass. Their screeches echoed inhumanly, reverberating off steel until it seemed the whole hive howled. Last fire lit the tunnels in bursts, illuminating grotesque tableau, gangers dragged into the dark, their screams cut short by tearing flesh, a child snatched from a mother's arms, the shadows swallowing them before the mother's cry could fade. Knives clanged against carapace that should not have grown, and blood steamed in the chill air, mixing human red with fluids of alien hue. Refugees scattered in panic, some running into the dark, others clinging to one another in futile defiance. The gangs tried to fight, their bravado forced into courage by necessity, but their numbers dwindled quickly. Their cruelty meant nothing to the creatures of the deep. These things were not swayed by fear or power, they were hunger made flesh, and hunger was endless. Refugees who survived the first wave spoke later of stranger sights, of creatures that paused to stare at them, heads cocked unnaturally, as if studying more than hunting, of shapes that seemed to shimmer with the auroral colors leaking down through cracks in the ceiling, their twisted bodies outlined in green and crimson fire. Some swore the creatures whispered in the same voices that had haunted their prayers, promising release if they surrendered, if they stopped resisting. Few admitted such things aloud, but the terror was plain in their eyes. The tunnels became killing fields. Corpses littered the ground, gnawed and mangled, the steel slick beneath bare feet. Smoke from burnt-out lamps mixed with the stink of death. Blinding and suffocating. Every step further downward felt like walking willingly into the maw of something vast and waiting. And still, they went on, because the only way out was forward. Above them, the manufactorums had no mercy. Behind them, the gangs ruled with knives. Ahead of them, the abyss itself opened its jaws. Yet even in this horror, a few clung to hope, fragile and tattered as it was. They whispered that somewhere below, deep in the forgotten machine levels, there were hidden vaults, old shelters sealed during the hive's. The survivors staggered deeper, driven less by will than by the instinct to flee. Every corridor seemed to fold into another, pipes hissing with ancient pressure, walls vibrating with a pulse too steady to be mechanical. The chittering above and behind never stopped. It became a rhythm in the bones, a constant reminder that the hunters had not given up, only chosen to herd their prey further downward. Then they found the door. It was unlike anything else in the underhive, massive, sealed with plates of blackened steel and embossed with the cog-toothed skull of the Mechanicus. Unlike the rusted ruin of the surrounding bulkheads, the door gleamed faintly, uncorroded, as though time itself dared not touch it. Runes pulsed along its frame, dim but steady, shedding a pale glow that bathed the survivors in sickly light. The air smelled of ozone, sharp and unnatural, cutting through the stink of rot and blood. Some fell to their knees, convinced it was salvation. The symbol of the machine god promised protection, order, sanctuary. Others whispered fearfully, knowing that if the Mechanicus had sealed this place, it was not for the safety of men but to hide something far worse. Yet hunger and terror left no room for choice. The refugees pressed forward, their hands scraping at the door's surface, their whispers turning into frantic prayers. With a groan that echoed like thunder through the tunnels, the seals disengaged. The door did not open by their strength but by its own design, responding to some unseen trigger. Pistons hissed, gears clanked and the plates parted, exhaling a gust of air that reeked of dust and old chemicals. Beyond lay darkness, deeper than the night they had fled, a black that swallowed torchlight whole. Inside, the chamber stretched vast, filled with forgotten machinery that loomed like titans slumbering in shadow. Cables as thick as a man's torso hung from the ceiling, trailing into pools of stagnant fluid that shimmered with the auroral colors leaking from cracks above. Banks of consoles lined the walls, their surfaces etched with Binharic script, screens flickering weakly with light despite centuries of abandonment. The place was not dead, it dreamed. At the center rose a great column of steel and glass, its surface fogged from within, shapes moving faintly behind the frost. Servitors perhaps, or something older. The survivors could not tell. All they knew was the sense of being watched, not by one presence but by many, each gaze cold and precise, dissecting their every movement. The air thrummed with static, prickling the skin, making hair stand on end. Whispers rose, not from mouths but from the walls themselves, carried on broken vox lines that still crackled faintly with power. Fragments of litany, prayers twisted into machine cant, words half human and half binary. Some among the refugees fell into trances, their lips moving in perfect sync with the static, chanting phrases they could not possibly know. Others fled toward the door, only to find it had sealed shut behind them, the cog skull burning faintly with crimson light. And then the sound came, a grinding from deep below, vast and ponderous, as if something buried beneath the chamber stirred. The survivors froze, hearts hammering, as the machinery around them shuddered back to life. Lights flickered brighter, Binharic script scrolled faster across the consoles, and the shapes within the glass stirred more clearly. Fingers twitched against the frost, eyes opened glowing faintly with inhuman light. The refugees had come seeking shelter. Instead they had opened a door that was never meant to be touched. The underhive fell silent, as though even its predators knew to wait. And in that silence the survivors realized that their descent had not carried them away from death. It had carried them straight into its heart. The chamber did not welcome them. It consumed them. The great vault of the Mechanicus was no sanctuary, but a wound stitched shut and left to fester. Its machines, though silent for centuries, stirred faintly as though waking from a half-dream. Sparks danced across broken conduits, illuminating the survivors in flashes of cold blue light, their gaunt faces reflected in panels of polished steel. The static that whispered through the vox lines had shape now like a voice struggling to form, syllables just beyond recognition. They gathered close around the central column, too terrified to flee yet too desperate to look away. The glass was streaked with frost, but through it, vague forms shifted, figures neither fully man nor machine, their outlines grotesque, fused with cables and augmetics that pulsed faintly with light. For a moment, some thought these were saints preserved against time, guardians of forgotten knowledge. Others saw only abominations, blasphemies against both flesh and spirit. Whatever they were not dead. The Mechanicus had sealed this place for a reason. That truth gnawed at every survivor who stared too long into the shadows. This chamber had been built not to preserve, but to contain. Yet famine and fear had driven them to pry open its gates, and now they were locked inside with secrets that should never have been unearthed. Then came the first awakening. A servitor slumped against the wall, twitched, its limbs jerking as though strings had been pulled by unseen hands. Its vox grill sputtered to life, stammering half-words in Binharic cant. It turned its head toward the group, eyes glowing faintly, and dragged itself upright with movements both clumsy and deliberate. Its voice was broken static, yet within that noise the refugees thought they heard fragments of meaning, phrases about continuation of function and reactivation of cycle. One of the survivors, a woman whose faith had not yet cracked, stepped forward, clutching an Aquila charm to her chest. She demanded to know if salvation lay within these walls, if the Emperor's will still guided the machines. The servitor did not answer. It simply raised a trembling augmetic hand and pointed toward the central column. The glass there shivered, the frost breaking apart, and the shapes inside began to move more clearly. The survivors pressed back against the walls, terror choking them. Some cried out in prayer, others in despair. The chamber filled with the sound of machines groaning awake, cables thrumming with power, consoles flaring with lines of Binharic code. The air grew hot, tasting of copper and ozone, a storm of energy building within the sealed vault. And over it all, the auroras seeped through cracks in the ceiling, their crimson and green light washing over the machinery as though feeding it. One man swore he saw faces in those lights, reflected against the glass of the column, faces of the dead, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with accusation. Another claimed he heard his own name spoken, not by the living, but by the static itself. The voices seemed to coil around them, not threatening, not comforting, but beckoning, as if the machines offered a choice no mortal could refuse. But choice was an illusion. The Mechanicus had sealed this vault for eternity, and by opening it, the survivors had unleashed what was never meant to breathe again. The glass cracked with a sound like splitting bone, the figures within pressed against the barrier, their hands smeared across the fogged surface, fingers clawing as if desperate to emerge. And in that moment, the survivors knew that they were not witnesses to salvation, they were witnesses to resurrection. The cracks spread like lightning across the glass, branching into a web of fractures that pulsed with inner light. The survivors pressed against the walls, clutching one another, their breath shallow in the charged air. With a final groan, the glass split open, shards sliding outward, and the chamber filled with a hiss of stale vapor, thick and acrid. From within, the figures emerged, one by one, dragging themselves into the open. They were not human. Not anymore. Once, perhaps, their flesh had been that of men and women pressed into service by the machine god, but centuries of containment had reshaped them into something else entirely. Augmetics fused seamlessly with bone, cables writhed where veins should have been, and metal plates pulsed faintly with a heartbeat that was both organic and mechanical. Their eyes glowed faintly red, not the steady optics of the Skitarii, but something fevered, alive with will. The first of them stumbled forward, its limbs unsteady, movements jerky and half-formed, as though memory of flesh warred against the rhythm of machine. Then it straightened. Its gaze swept the chamber, slow and deliberate, before fixing on the cluster of survivors huddled in the shadows. No word passed its lips, yet the refugees felt its presence press against their minds, heavy and cold, like being pinned beneath iron. Some fell to their knees trembling. Others covered their ears, as though the silence itself screamed. The machines around them surged to life. Consoles blazed with strings of binaric data, their symbols streaming faster than eyes could follow. The vox lines whispered in overlapping tongues, fragments of litanies and prayers twisted into something alien. One phrase recurred again and again, broken across countless voices, cycle incomplete. Function must resume. Error, continuation required. Whispers spread among the survivors. Some claimed these beings were custodians left behind, tasked with preserving the hive until the Imperium returned. Others hissed that they were heresies, half-human abominations sealed away to keep their corruption from spreading. A few dared a third thought, that they were something in between, fragments of knowledge too dangerous for either man or machine, condemned to rot until chance loosed them. Faith wavered in that vault. The Aquila charms clutched by desperate hands felt suddenly small, fragile things. One woman screamed that the Emperor had sent these guardians to lead them out of the darkness. Another spat that they were servants of the warp, reflections of the auroras bleeding through the cracks. Both fell silent as one of the awakened forms raised its arm, a limb more weapon than flesh, and released a low keening wail of vox distortion that made the walls tremble. It was not an attack, it was a signal. From the depths below, the sound was answered. A grinding roar rose through the floor, shaking the chamber, rattling the steel plates until dust fell from the ceiling. Something vast stirred in the darkness beneath the vault, something that had slumbered longer than memory. The awakened beings turned their heads downward in unison, their glowing eyes reflecting the auroral light above. For the first time since entering the Underhive, the refugees realized that they were not merely trapped, they were standing upon the threshold of something older, deeper, and infinitely worse than the gangs or the predators of the shadows. And still, the whispers grew. The static bled into words, weaving promises and warnings together, until they became indistinguishable. Some survivors swore they heard the Emperor's voice among them, distant and sorrowful, urging them to endure. Others heard laughter, cruel and vast, echoing with the hunger of the warp. Both could not be true. Perhaps neither was. What was certain was this: the vault had awakened, and with it the planet's fate drew nearer. The vault breathed. That was how it felt, though the walls were metal and the air was still as tomb dust. A pulse passed through the chamber, subtle at first, then stronger, like the beat of some buried heart. The refugees clung to one another as the awakened figures moved with newfound certainty, their steps deliberate, their every motion guided by purpose that no mortal tongue could name. Their presence fractured the survivors' fragile unity. A ragged priest, robes torn and face streaked with grime, raised his arms and cried out in cracked voice that these were angels of the Omnissiah, sent to lift them from despair. He bowed low before the nearest figure, pressing his forehead against its augmetic foot, chanting half-forgotten canticles. Others fell with him, their hunger and terror twisting into fevered reverence. They wept as though salvation had come at last, blind to the alien stillness in the machine's gaze. But not all bent their knees. A scarred ganger, his skin inked with the sigils of his fallen clan, spat into the dust and called them abominations. He gathered the defiant around him, swearing that these constructs were mockeries, that to kneel was to betray terror itself. His words were fire, and soon fists rose against those who prayed, shoving, striking, voices rising to a frenzy. It might have come to slaughter, had the machines themselves not intervened. One stepped forward, its body humming with energy, and released a tone through its vox grill, low, steady, impossible to ignore. It cut through both prayer and defiance alike. The warring mortals froze, their rage curdled into silence. Then the machine extended an arm, and the vault obeyed. The floor shuddered, splitting along lines hidden for centuries. Panels shifted, sliding apart, revealing a spiral descent into darkness. A smell rose from below, metallic and sour, like rust mingled with old blood. The survivors recoiled, but the kneeling priest laughed through his tears, proclaiming it the pathway to redemption. The ganger cursed, swore it was the mouth of damnation itself. Both looked upon the abyss with equal awe. From the spiral depths came a sound, faint yet undeniable, the grinding cadence of colossal gears turning after an eternity of rest. Dust and ash cascaded into the pit, drawn down as though by a breath. The awakened figures stood at the edge, their eyes glowing brighter, pulses of light beating in rhythm with the subterranean machine. And then the whispers returned, stronger than before, flooding every skull with overlapping voices. One promised release, another promised power, a third crooned of silence everlasting, where no fear or hunger remained. Each survivor heard something different, and in that difference lay their doom. Some wept with joy, swearing they had heard the Emperor. Others wailed, certain they had heard only daemons. A few simply stared, blank-eyed, their sanity unraveling thread by fragile thread. Faith splintered, trust dissolved. The survivors, once bound by shared suffering, now stood divided on the knife's edge of belief and despair. Below, the spiral yawned wide, waiting. No choice remained, but to follow where it led. The descent was like a passage into memory itself, though no human memory could endure such weight. The spiral stairs groaned beneath each step, shedding flakes of rust that vanished into the black beneath. The survivors clutched the rails where they still held fast, the metal slick with condensation, their palms trembling not only from fear but from the strange vibrations coursing through the structure. Each pulse felt alive, like a heartbeat echoing from the planet's core. The awakened figures moved without hesitation, gliding as though the way was theirs alone. Their silhouettes cast long shadows against the walls, distortions shaped not only by failing lumen strips, but by some inner radiance that leaked through the seams of their flesh and steel. For every mortal step, there was doubt. Was this salvation, or were they marching willingly into the throat of damnation? Whispers dogged them still. The further they sank, the clearer the voices became. No longer fragmented, they came as overlapping sermons, as though countless preachers from across ages stood at once in the darkness, each declaring a different gospel. One voice thundered of fire and cleansing, another spoke of patience and rebirth, another of silence that was not death but a stillness beyond comprehension. No two survivors heard the same words. The vault had reached into their hearts and tailored truth itself to fit each fragile soul. When the stairs finally ended, they stood in a cavern vast enough to drown thought. Machinery towered in the dark, titanic constructs whose original shape had long been lost to corrosion and overgrowth. Cables thicker than men hung like vines, dripping moisture into pools that reflected faint auroral light. Cogitator banks whispered in broken Binharic, ancient logic routines running without command. And at the center, a machine so massive it seemed carved from the bones of the planet itself. It was a throne, or something like it, though no mortal ruler would sit upon it. Its frame was built for something neither fully human nor entirely machine, its back studded with ports and sockets, its arms ending in interfaces for communion with systems that no longer existed above. The survivors stared in silence, awe mingled with dread. Some dropped to their knees, proclaiming it the Emperor's gift, a fragment of his dominion preserved beneath the hive. Others recoiled, whispering that it was a heretic altar, a prison for some forbidden entity the Mechanicus had sought to bury and forget. The awakened forms approached it, moving with ritual precision. They ascended the stairs of the throne, each one taking a position around its base. Their voices rose in Binharic chant, tones so alien that the air itself seemed to vibrate in resonance. The great machine stirred, cables twitching, gears straining, the cavern trembling as though the very crust of the planet resisted what was to come. And in that moment, the refugees understood the final cruelty of their plight. They had not stumbled into sanctuary, nor into ruin left dormant. They had been drawn, pulled by hunger, by fear, by chance, or by will unseen, into the very heart of their world's condemnation. The throne was not a relic. It was a signal. Somewhere above, in the void beyond the aurora-choked skies, a listening ear would hear, and once heard there would be no turning back. The throne did not rise. It bled into motion. A low hum began in the core, reverberating through the cavern, deep and vibrating enough to make the very walls shiver. The awakened forms knelt at its base, hands pressed against its frame, augmetic fingers tracing patterns lost to the memory of men. The machine pulsed in response, each beat stronger, sending tremors that ran up the survivors' spines. Their breaths came in short, ragged gasps. Some wept, convinced the Emperor's will had returned to them at last. Others shook in terror, muttering curses, certain that they had summoned an unholy force from beneath the planet. The cavern itself seemed to lean inward, as though listening, as though judging. Every flicker of auroral light from above traced the edges of the throne, painting it in violent strokes of green and crimson. Shadows danced unnaturally across the walls, forming shapes too vast to be human, too deliberate to be random. The first among the awakened forms rose, towering now, limbs elongated, cables writhed like serpents along its spine. Its eyes were too many, scattered across its head and shoulders, glowed red and orange, burning with something like cognition. It reached toward the central column of the throne, connecting with ports that seemed to suck life from the air itself. A vibration filled the cavern, low and insistent, as though the machine had recognized the planet and its pulse. The survivors fell silent. Even the fiercest gangs, who had clawed their way through death and darkness, could only watch. A voice, or a multitude of voices, rose from the static, chanting in unison with the machine, fragments of Binharic, fragments of human prayer, fragments of something older and unknown. It was not threatening, not exactly. It was inevitable. The throne's awakening had begun, and the planet itself trembled beneath the strain. Whispers spread among the survivors, some incoherent, others horrifyingly clear. One claimed that the Emperor himself would descend, calling judgment upon those who had dared defile the underhive. Another swore it was the warp, bending the Mechanicus's machinery into its own will, preparing the hive for consumption. A third said nothing, staring silently, understanding that mortal comprehension had already failed. Then came the signal. It began faintly, a vibration into the void, a pulse into the warp, or perhaps both. The survivors felt it more than heard it, deep in their bones. The awakened forms seemed to feed on it, growing taller, movements more fluid, as though each heartbeat of the signal strengthened their purpose. Somewhere high above, beyond the auroras and the clouds of smoke, fleet sensors would detect it. Somewhere even further, the Imperium would hear it and understand. The planet had marked itself for doom. Some survivors cried out, praying for salvation. Others shrieked in terror, clawing at one another, fleeing deeper into the vault. But there was nowhere to run. The cavern's walls pulsed with energy. The awakened forms moved with precision, herding the living toward the spiral pit that led even deeper, toward machinery and chambers too vast to comprehend. The whispers grew into a choir, bending perception, fragmenting thought, until even the most steadfast of minds began to unravel. And above it all, the pulse continued, sending its signal skyward. A chain reaction had begun. The throne was not merely a machine, it was a beacon, and the stars themselves listened now. Somewhere in the void, distant ears would hear the cry, and the Emperor's fleet, or something answering in his name, would reckon with the planet. Exterminatus had begun, not with fire, but with signal, with inevitability, with the weight of 1,000 years of forgotten vigilance finally pressing down. The survivors, huddled in awe, and terror could do nothing but watch as the vault and the throne embraced the doom to come. Their world had not ended in fire, not yet, it had ended in inevitability, and the echoes of ruin spread outward, through cavern, hive and void, until all that remained was waiting. The spiral pit yawned wider, swallowing torches and shadow alike, and the survivors were drawn to its edge, compelled by fear, hunger, and some instinct older than reason. The awakened forms guided them without words, their motions precise, deliberate, ritualized. The cavern trembled beneath each step, steel and stone vibrating as if the planet itself were aware of its doom. The air reeked of ozone and iron, each breath a reminder that life here was fragile and fleeting. Some of the survivors fell to their knees, murmuring prayers they could no longer believe in, their voices shaking as the whispers from the throne wrapped around their minds. Others resisted, fighting the pull, fists striking shadows, teeth bared, hearts hammering in futility. No force of will could counter the inevitability that pressed against them. The throne, the awakened forms, the pulse in the earth, they were all parts of the same design, and the design did not account for mercy. Above them the auroras bled into the upper sky, faint yet persistent, casting a green and crimson glow that flickered against the shattered spires and ruined manufacture. Ships beyond orbit responding to distant signals would read the pulse in ways the survivors could never know. Somewhere sensors aboard a distant fleet would interpret the readings as the final confirmation. This planet had lived long enough, and now it must be purged to maintain the Imperium's order. Within the vault, the awakened forms arranged themselves around the spiral, their eyes glowing brighter, their pulses synchronizing with the central throne. Every movement, every whisper, every hum of the machinery seemed to prepare the hive for the reckoning to come. The survivors, fragile and human, became witnesses to forces too vast to oppose, trapped in a ritual whose purpose had been written before any of them drew breath. Some few tried to resist still, to find a way out, to flee upward toward the surface and the false promise of air and light. They found walls had shifted, corridors twisted, and the very architecture itself seemed to conspire against escape. Every turn led deeper, every step closer to the throne and the inevitable culmination of the planet's judgment. And then the pulse crescendoed. The cavern seemed to inhale, a soundless but massive intake, and the throne's lights flared, red and green bleeding into a spectrum the eye could not hold. The awakened forms stood rigid, extensions twitching, cables writhing, as though they were conduits for some greater will reaching through the Mechanicus design. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as if reality bent for an instant to accommodate what was about to happen. The survivors could do nothing but watch as the machine and the planet, the pulse and the awakened aligned in perfect terrible harmony. Each understood, instinctively, that their world's end was no longer distant speculation or rumor, it was imminent. The Exterminatus signal, sent through ritual pulse and machinery, had begun its passage into the void, and the Imperium would respond as it always did, with fire purging all life deemed unworthy, leaving only ash and silence. Some prayed, some screamed. Some sat in stunned silence, gazing at the throne and the glowing forms, knowing that their lives were threads in a tapestry too vast to comprehend. And above them the auroras burned, witnessing and reflecting, as though the very stars themselves understood the planet's doom. No one knew if the Emperor's gaze lingered on them, or if it had long since turned elsewhere. What mattered was irrelevant. The vault, the throne, the awakened forms and the pulse were enough. Life here had reached its terminus, and the echoes of ruin would ripple outward, through the hive, across the surface, into orbit and into eternity. The survivors did not die immediately. They could not. Instead they became silent witnesses, their breaths shallow, their hearts racing, as the world above and below prepared itself for the final judgment. And in that silence, in the pulse of the awakened throne, in the hum of machinery, and the distant whisper of auroras, they understood, some ends do not arrive in fire, some do not arrive in war, some arrive in inevitability. And this was one such end.